everyone, and welcome to In Contrast. My name is Alan.
And I'm Nisha.
On this podcast, we talk about movies and the books that they're based on, and we try to answer the age-old question, is the book better than the movie?
The catch is that you watch the movie and I read the book, with a few exceptions.
That's right. So today we're going to be talking about Blade Runner, aka Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So the original story, which you have read, was by Philip K. Dick, released in 1972?
1968.
68, my bad. And this was later adapted in 1982 by Ridley Scott into the movie Blade Runner, starring Harrison Ford. And then it has since spawned a sequel, and I believe even a potential TV series coming out soon. So it has stayed very present in society.
Yeah. Before we get too far, I need to be completely transparent and say that I read this about 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. Life got in the way of recording. It's no one's fault. But you will have to excuse my spotty memory.
It was a little bit my fault.
It was a little bit your fault, a little bit everyone's fault.
It happened.
But I did try to take notes, so hopefully I can remember. Anyway, like you said, the book was published in 1968. It's by Philip K. Dick, or PKD, as some people call him. This is an early and quite influential sci-fi about a bounty hunter reckoning with his morality. And it's set in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And maybe Monterey, California. We'll talk about that more later, though.
Okay, then. Well, the movie differs slightly in that aspect. It's set in a 2019 Los Angeles, though it does seem like, as I'm sure we'll get into, basically the entire California coast is just one massive city at this point in time, so it doesn't really matter too much. But so this movie is Ridley Scott's second major movie as a director. It was, again, his second time going into science fiction. He had done Alien just 2 years prior to this, or maybe 3 years prior. And this was also an early film for Harrison Ford. So this was, he had done also some sci-fi and had just been finishing up Raiders of the Lost Ark at this point. His first role is Indiana Jones. But he wanted to get into something a little more serious for this movie. So that's why he chose the role. So kind of just getting into what I think about it, this had been a really long time since I had seen the original. I saw 2049 when it came out. I did end up watching that again for this podcast. I felt like it was justifiable to do that, because I really think it's a very strong sequel, but I'll get into more of my thoughts about that later. But as far as the original, to put it blankly, I fully think that it deserves its place as like a legacy sci-fi movie, but I felt myself being a little disappointed by it. I'll definitely get into more of the details why I felt that way, but just to summarize it very succinctly, I think that it's more style than substance.
That's really interesting. That kind of harkens back to The Shining. Because I felt that way about the book, right?
Right.
Highly influential, super disappointing. Also funny, I actually enjoyed the book. I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, as you know, so I was really worried about going into this. But I read it and I was like, yeah, I'm glad I read this book, actually. I was getting into it. Particularly from a 2023 perspective, it's super interesting. PKD, as we will call him. He had interesting foresight, but his creativity also seemed lacking in some areas. So he could imagine this future with, like, androids and hover cars. But for some reason, all the secretaries are still women. And they still use physical currency. Obviously, this is 1968 we're talking about. And he was actually quite liberal. Really interesting guy. The story itself, though, is super interesting, and it poses many ethical questions about humanity. I don't think that it seeks to answer any of them, though. It just makes you think. Something really interesting I want to tell you about. PKD. He died in 1982. Uh-huh. The year the movie came out. So he sold the rights for the script in actually 1977. Ridley Scott was not going to do the movie.
Right.
But after Dune, he wanted something more fast-paced because his brother had just died. So he took up the movie and did it. And unfortunately, Philip K. Dick died before the movie came out, so we cannot talk about his opinions. But I believe in 1970, another script was submitted to him that he actually rejected. So we do know he approved of the script, at least.
Do you remember who did that script?
I
remember reading about it, but now it's slipping my mind.
I can find it for you.
Scorsese.
There
Yeah, Scorsese
we go. I
was
just found it as you said that.
Yeah, he had generated some interest in making it, but it never happened, I guess.
Yeah. He never optioned it.
Right.
Producer Herb Jaffa optioned it in the early 1970s, but Dick was unimpressed, saying that Jaffa, I don't know if Jaffa is how his name is pronounced.
I have no idea who
Jaffe. His screenplay was so terribly done. Robert flew down to Santa Ana to speak with me about the project, and the first thing I said to him when he got off the plane was, "Shall I beat you up here at the airport, or shall I beat you up back at my apartment?" That's Philip K. Dick speaking.
So it wasn't too much of a secret how he felt. Well, I think he had a general distaste for Hollywood anyway. Didn't really feel like that they knew how to capture things. Which, granted, at that point in time, especially dealing with sci-fi, probably is the case. There was definitely some earlier examples of sci-fi that were good in movies, but I mean, generally speaking, I could see why he might not expect them to do very well with building this world.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially given that it's set in 2019, which for us is now in the past, easily replicatable. That was 68 to 2019 is 50 years.
It's a pretty big amount of time.
Yeah. So there's a lot that has to go into it. And it's interesting, actually, to me that they decided to go with Los Angeles instead of San Francisco. And it seems like he approved of that.
I don't know what his feelings were about it, but it does seem like in general by the end of, like, he definitely saw the finished script and the screenplay, and I think that he generally approved of it and liked it. And I think that I saw that he did see some, like, early test screenings and things, not of a completed movie, but just he got to see the world. And that he did say it was a good representation of how he envisioned it.
Yeah, I think he only died 4 months before the film came out. And it was quite a sudden death. So it wasn't like he was deteriorating. He had a stroke suddenly. He called his therapist and was like, "Should I go to the hospital?" And the therapist was like, "Yes." And then he did not go to the hospital. You know, genius apparently. But I think he was actually quite involved up until, he wasn't involved. But that's about the end of the production process anyway. The last few months, there's not too much you can do anymore in movie making.
Right. That's kind of a shame too, because I think, many of his works have been adapted and they all would have been past that point. So he never really got to see any of that.
Yeah, I think this was the first of his works to be adapted.
Yeah.
So he didn't even get to see the first.
I know much later, like Minority Report and a couple others have been adapted, and then of course just to, we have to talk about just the influence of how this changed science fiction. I mean, I don't know fully which elements are in the book versus the movie. We'll talk about all that, and I'm actually curious to have this conversation because I think it might shape how I feel about the movie even as we talk about it, because I'm still a little bit conflicted. But I mean, this was a huge piece for science fiction going forward, both the book and the movie, even being so far, almost a decade apart from release. They still had massive, massive influence on everything going forward. And, especially when you talk about like the cyberpunk genre or like dystopian sci-fi. Yeah,
it really sounds like the book was kind of like the grandfather or the herald of cyberpunk as a genre. You see dystopian elements in different books. You see sci-fi in other books. There's a lot of conversation about like Mary Shelley and sci-fi, and she's years before him.
Right.
But cyberpunk, I think he was kind of the beginning, and everyone just took it and ran and like built on it.
Yeah, his was, I think there were a few other books and things that came out in that decade in between the story and the movie. But I think Blade Runner as the film was pretty much the first like visual representation of this. There may have been a comic book or something, in between, towards the later part of the 70s, but it was really one of the first times that it had been fully visualized, and it does do a fantastic job of visualizing that type of dystopian future.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I'm kind of curious about how technology is incorporated with people. Like, nowadays, when we think cyberpunk, I feel like there's more like cybernetic enhancements in people, So obviously there's the game that came out called Cyberpunk, and that, if you look at it, is kind of the pinnacle of what cyberpunk is nowadays. People
it's like the culmination of everything.
Exactly. People getting enhancements. That wasn't really in the book. It was still this separation between like artificial and real.
Right. Yeah, and that's also the case in the movie. It doesn't really expand on that too much, but I guess in the sequel it starts to play around with that a little bit more. So if you look at just the universe itself, like going forward in time, that starts to happen more. But yeah, as a genre, it seems like cyberpunk, and then I guess they usually call it like biopunk, were considered pretty separate. I mean, obviously part of the same generals, but they were separated subgenres.
Okay.
Where, you know, like cyborgs and things like that, those genetic enhancements were kind of a separate thing that weren't present in this, yeah.
So like RoboCop is biopunk.
Sure.
Got it.
But also very much, you know, cyberpunk feel. But it doesn't have those certain elements of it. And I think something, to me anyway, that's a piece of the movie that I really, really liked. I don't know how this is presented in the book, but a lot of early cyberpunk especially had this very like neo-noir kind of feel to it. And that's a big, big thing in this movie.
Yeah, that was very intentional for Philip K. Dick. He really purposefully leaned into the hard-boiled detective feel. And obviously in the book, Deckard is a bounty hunter. I think the main character in the movie is also a bounty hunter. Is it Deckard?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nick Deckard.
I genuinely know nothing about the movie.
Right.
I have not even seen the ads for them. I've seen like very few things, so I don't know anything. It could be completely different for all I know.
I'm sure you've seen a lot of visuals about
Yes.
it, but never like the details, yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, he really leaned into that like noir, hard-boiled detective feel. And I think he kind of even had like the femme fatale element and stuff like that with Rachel Rawson. Again, don't know if she's in the movie.
She is. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yes, and that's very much how she's presented in the movie as well.
She's supposed to be very attractive, and she even seduces him eventually in the book to sort of bring up a moral dilemma in him.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So she seduces him in the book. I mean, right there, that's something that's noteworthy to me.
I mean, I'm going to be honest. That's how a lot of it was explained in the Spark Notes I read. When I read that scene, and I do remember that scene, I wouldn't refer to either of them as seducing the other.
Okay.
It was, quite frankly, the, like, least sexy sex scene I've ever read. It's just them being like, let's meet at a hotel. Okay. And then they meet at the hotel, and she's like, for some reason, undressing herself, but it doesn't, like, there's no allure described in the way she's undressing herself. And it also is completely lost on me why he even sleeps with her.
See, I feel the same way about how the romance is in the movie. I like the story itself when it comes to that. Like, it presents an interesting sequence of events, I guess. But the actual way that it's presented and shown, I don't get it. She is like, yes, she's very pretty, and she's like striking when she's introduced, and she does have that kind of femme fatale look. Like, that's certainly there. But like, the whole time I'm just thinking to myself, like, why are they a thing?
Yeah.
Like, it didn't make sense. And he's very much more the one that initiates in the movie.
They're not really, I wouldn't call them a thing in the book, because in the book they meet at I think it's called the Rawson Association, the manufacturer of these androids.
Right.
They're like based in Oregon or wherever it is. He gives her the test, he leaves, and then he hears from her one more time saying like, hey, if you're going to hunt androids, you should have an android on your side. And then he's like calling her because some other guy told him he should sleep with an android because he's like, for some reason, in love with her. But I don't understand why. Like, there's some serious disconnect. And I think that's part of the problem with this being such a short novel. I guess it's actually a novella, probably. Is that there's some details lacking. But I would also argue that maybe a man who got divorced 5 times from 5 different women is not an expert in romance.
True.
That being said, I would expect the movie, having so many more people in it, to consider those things a little bit more. You know, where is their connection? What is their romance? But that seems lacking in both.
Well, that's part of the problem in the movie in general, is that, like, actual story plot and character development kind of is to the side.
So that's kind of on your hot takes.
I wouldn't say that it's a hot take. My hot take is that I feel like 2049 actually does a better job than the original with that.
All right.
We'll just drop that in right now. I'll explain more about that later. And like I said, I'm still a little bit conflicted. And especially, I really felt disappointed the first viewing, and then I watched it again, and even though I watched the worst cut, I still appreciated different parts of it that were present in both.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know, maybe the more I watch it, the more I'll like it, but I just remember really liking it when I first watched it, and then this time it just fell a little flat. But yeah, it's mostly because, and this is even something that when you look at the stories from the set of the making of this movie, you know, Harrison Ford and Ridley Scott were about to murder each other during the making of this movie. Now, they've since gotten better, and they're friendly now and whatever, but yeah, Harrison Ford said that he would have strangled him given the chance in a second. And I think, you know, there's a lot of argument to be made on both sides of this. Ridley Scott is always kind of a style over substance kind of guy.
Okay.
You know, he's very much like an earlier kind of Christopher Nolan type. Like those two are like side by side in my mind, because they know how to create a really interesting visual and like atmospheric world, but there's not a lot else to it. And so when they were making this movie, there's a lot of stories about the actors, especially Harrison Ford, trying to have conversations with Ridley Scott about their characters and, you know, how they should present themselves and all this stuff. And he kind of just blew them off. He didn't really have these conversations. He was much more interested in, you know, what sign am I going to have in the back of this shot? Or like, you know, he spent so much time, or like having the set completely redone multiple times in a day because he didn't like the way it looked or something, you know. This is, again, one of those kind of eccentric directors, which will probably come up a lot in this podcast. Not dissimilar to our last episode. But yeah, you hear all these stories and then you watch the movie, and I can't say that I'm surprised.
Yeah. So while you were talking, I was doing a little bit of research. When the book was released, PKD was on his fourth wife. So already romance was gone for him, I'm guessing. He'd had some pretty bad relationships also, some of which he, I believe it was his third wife, he thought was trying to kill him, and he had committed.
Oh, cool.
Of course, this was like the 50s, so I'd kind of be interested to read a little bit more about that. You know, they had, I think, just stopped lobotomizing women, or they were just about to. Ridley Scott did not write the screenplay.
Right.
Which
It
explains...
was a group of a couple people.
Yeah, it was Hampton Fancher and David Peoples. Fancher? I'm not sure. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But that kind of explains a lot. And he didn't want to do it. You know, so he didn't write it. He did not want to direct it. He was actually just directing it because he was grieving. Yeah. Which I totally get. You know, that's fair. You're an artist. You want to have fun creating art when you're grieving. Like, believe me, that's what I do. Right. But it also means that his heart and mind were probably not in the right place to... He was doing this for himself, basically. Yeah. He wasn't doing it for anyone else. So, of course...
No one was going to get any help from
him. But that does make it interesting that you'd think the script would have fleshed out some of these character moments more, right? Like, there would be cues in the script. So, that does bring me back all the way to the script and asking, like, what's lacking there, you know? So it is like, it's like each building block is missing relationships. You know, you got the book at the bottom. Their relationship is just like, why do you think you love her? Like, he thinks he loves her and has an affair with her.
And none of that's ever explained.
Exactly. And then you have the script, which probably does not explore that. We should have actually looked up the script and read it if we could have. And then on top of that building block is a director who does not care. He just wants neon cyberpunk sci-fi, not the characters. He wants the shot and not the people. So he'd almost be a better photographer.
Which, again, like, it made for a visually, like, absolutely stunning movie. Some of the best special effects over the last few decades, like, it definitely still holds up from, like, a visual and an atmospheric perspective, like, undoubtedly. But it's just missing a lot of the rest. And even the pieces that you can praise for a lot of the characters and sort of the interesting things that they did. A lot of that was just the actors coming up with stuff themselves. Like the best example probably being, I don't know if this is something that's present in the book, I'm going to guess not, is that they use what's called city speak.
I don't think that's in the book.
Yeah, so this is like a partner detective that works alongside Deckard. His name is Gaff, I believe.
Okay.
Played by Edward James Olmos. But Edward James Olmos is the one that came up with the idea of him to speak in what's called city speak. And it's kind of this conglomeration of language, like, not quite Esperanto, but somewhere in that realm where it's, you're seeing the blending of all these cultures in this future city. Mm-hmm. So he had the idea of like, well, this would cause some people to speak differently, right?
Yeah.
So he put that in himself. Had nothing to do with any of the rest of the writers or anything.
Yeah. I have a feeling sci-fi is probably best done by an extremely diverse group. Because each person will see the trajectory of different things. Evidently, the guy who plays Gaff had the foresight to know language evolves.
Right.
Ridley Scott had the foresight to think neon signs are exciting, right?
They were both right.
They were both right. But when you have a small group, or say one author trying to write sci-fi, particularly a white male in the 60s, and then you're trying to build off of that, it could limit some of the things you're trying to do. He's basing a lot of these things also probably on his own experiences, his own life, as opposed to branching out and that was for me, there were no people of color that I saw. But if you really start to think about the trajectory of our world, even back then, you should have seen more interracial couples, therefore a blending of cultures and at least people looking different and maybe more diversity in people, even if you haven't, like some sci-fi goes the complete opposite where there's like homogeny, but you can see that and I can say this because this is what I look like, but like the vaguely ethnic, but you don't know what they are, right? Like that kind of person.
Right.
So, I think that diversity probably would have really benefited the movie, and they had it there. They could have used it, but Ridley Scott failed to do so.
Well, I still want to talk about some of these characters a little bit more, but you brought it back to like a slightly bigger picture thing, which I think we should go into, which is kind of the description of what this world looks like. I'm very curious how it's described in the book versus the movie, because you're saying that you're not seeing a lot of like diverse culture and stuff like that, but in the movie there very much is. It's not diverse as we are in the modern day, so I'm curious what the thinking was there, but it's very Asian. There's a lot of people are speaking Chinese or Japanese. There's a lot of Japanese signage all over the place.
Yeah.
Less related to the actual script, but like a lot of that city speak language incorporates like Hungarian and stuff a lot.
Okay.
Like it's kind of interesting in that way where it is a huge blend. So I was curious how the book, if it delved into that at all, if it was
not at all. Not even remotely. Like I don't think PKD even thought of a future with, and I'm not saying he himself was racist. He probably was, but
not any more than anyone else.
Not anymore, yeah. Especially for that period. Apparently he was quite liberal and he was like anti-Vietnam War. Right. But it does sound like in your case, like there were like concentration camps for Japanese people in California. There was a huge Asian immigration population here. And it sounds like they thought about that. And they were like, there will be a lot of that in the future. Or that will still be here. At least saying that will still be here, I think is a pretty fair stance. That was not at all present in the book. And he doesn't describe people too much. He describes some women, and frankly, they all look the same. Mm-hmm. There's like one guy he describes, and I cannot remember how he describes him. Actually, there's like two guys. But it's just like, there's not a lot of character description at all. So if he did imagine any kind of diversity in the people, it is not visible in their character descriptions or in their names or the way they speak or anything like that. And I imagine he was not imagining a world with much diversity because, as I said, all the secretaries were women.
Right.
All the officers were men. There's a dynamic that he was sticking to.
Well, and that's also an interesting aspect. Like I've seen both movies really, and obviously 2049 got hit a little harder with it because of just being released, in 2017. and it's something we're all a little more cognizant of. But they both got hit pretty hard with their portrayal of women, which it's an interesting conversation to have, because to me, neither one of them approach it as praising the portrayal of women. It's, to me, showing how the commodification of women has just persisted through this future. Like, especially in 2049, it's an even bigger aspect where there's a lot of just like naked women being advertised on the street, or like huge holograms of them and stuff like that. And so, that was something that was complained about a lot. But to me, it's also like, it's a very interesting aspect of it where like everything is just go, go, go. Everything is about the value of something, and that's kind of how women are treated in that world. So I don't know how you would feel about that. Obviously, you haven't seen the movies, but I don't know how you would feel about something like that.
It's one of those, and I'm going to say this a lot, and I think I said it last time. It's kind of like, maybe were they the right people to talk about the commodification of women in the future? Or another thing, and again, I have not seen it, so I can't give you a fair opinion, but were they obvious enough about it? Because I do think there's a place for subtlety in these conversations, and, how these things happen in, like, subtle ways, especially, like, you talk about racism. We have a term called microaggressions, because things are so frickin' subtle, people don't even realize it's racist until it's pointed out. But when we're in a society that all of that stuff still exists, you have to be a little bit more blunt with saying, like, this is the commodification of women and it's bad. You know what I mean? You can't just show it and hope that the audience gets it. But again, I haven't seen it, so...
In the original, it's less of an aspect, and I would say it's less blunt about it. In 2049, I felt like it was pretty upfront, that unless you were like actively trying not to pay attention, that you would realize that it's being presented as a negative thing. And
I mean, it could also just be, and believe me, I get this, being a woman watching these things, it's like, I don't want to watch another thing about women being commodified. It could just be as simple as that. I'm tired of seeing, every video game woman is in high heels and in a skin-tight outfit again. Oh boy, so it could be that too. There's no real commodification of women in the book. In fact, when Deckard sleeps with Rachel Rawson, she brings up that technically she can't give consent. And like, kind of teases
because she's not human?
Yeah, she's not human. She's programmed to do these things for him. So, it does bring up that interesting aspect. But
that's actually surprising to me that's in the book.
Yeah. Right? Like, all your women are secretary, but you're going to talk about consent? Pretty forward thinking. But I did like it. I thought it was pretty cool that they brought that up. But it was such like also a sentence that they said, Yeah. And yeah, it's just, he does objectify women more than men too, I'll say.
Sure.
Like, he keeps describing women's breasts as, what is it? Small and high.
Interesting.
No idea what that means. Maybe in the future,
it's not a good thing.
Your like breasts are on your collarbones or something, and they're tiny. But like, it was
There's no gravity in the future.
No gravity, even on Earth.
Well, okay, so I do want to go back to like the description of how the world is presented in the book a little more, but also just on that last note about Rachel specifically. That is one of the most, like, kind of weird aspects of the movie to me, is the, immediately Deckard, like, has this attraction to her, right?
Yeah.
And, of course, she's presented, I don't know, we'll get into how all the characters, like, think about themselves and what they know about themselves. In the movie, she doesn't realize she's a replicant at first. Mm-hmm. And so he kind of falls for her, realizes that she is anyway, but then he basically sexually assaults her.
Wow.
Like, they're in his apartment, and she, they have, like, this moment, and he tries to kiss her. She gets up and tries to leave. She has, like, just come to the realization that she's a replicant at this point.
Yeah.
And then he basically, like, slams the door and stops her and forces himself on her.
Wow.
And it's a really uncomfortable scene, really.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just found it to be very interesting. It was definitely, like, uncomfortable to watch.
Yeah.
But it's kind of just interesting that it's almost like a worse portrayal of that in the movie, it sounds like.
Yeah. She takes the android test and she fails when he first meets her in the book. Shortly thereafter, he realizes, no, she's an android. And that's when she realizes, supposedly, that she's an android. Honestly, I'm not sure that she thinks she's human or not. I wasn't totally clear on that at any point. But based on that one scene, she thinks she's human. And that she's just been on this, like, ship and has reduced levels of empathy because she's been away from people for so long. But after that, they really only have two more encounters, or 3 more, and 2 of them are from the phone. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. They're very much involved with each other in the movie. I mean, it's a little bit of back and forth just because there's other things going on, but yeah, it's definitely a major focal point.
I think it would have been interesting for her to actually... So he leaves. Deckard leaves the Rawson Association, and she calls him to say that he should have an android with her to hunt androids. He rejects that, but I honestly think it would have been interesting if you're, like, making that point of empathy versus humanity versus android or whatever. It would have been interesting to have that android along for the ride and see what happened.
Yeah.
But I guess her ultimate goal was also to convince him not to retire the androids, basically.
I see.
So that's why she sleeps with him. And there's only been one other man who... You know what? She must have known she was an android, because I think there was one other man she slept with, I think she says that, who went on to continue retiring androids, which is actually another officer that Deckard meets. His name is Phil Resch.
Okay.
He's also from Northern California. He works in this, like, shadow police station that is also supposedly retiring and hunting androids, but it's actually entirely run by androids. It's just a front.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, none of those people are present in the movie. I think the story deviates quite a bit on stuff like that. I just have a lot of questions that are coming up that are kind of all over the place, but so you know, one of the things in the movie, just to go back to how they view themselves, like, you know, one of the hotly debated things is that it's kind of ambiguous in the movie whether or not Deckard himself is a replicant or a human. Is that something that's pretty directly or even, like, played with at all in the book?
He has, like, weird doubts about stuff, but he talks about how all of these police officers have to take the test, Voight-Kampf test, I think it's called, and that he's passed it before, and that I think he even says someone else can give him a test or something like that. So he has, like, moments of crises, but it's mostly empathy. It's not wondering if he's an android. Also, I don't think the term replicant is ever used in the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
I think it's just android.
Well, there's a lot of different terminology that's, you know, like Blade Runner is not part of that. You know, that's an added... That came from a different sci-fi book, actually.
Okay.
That was also supposed to be... I think William Burroughs tried to adapt it into a screenplay that was never filmed. But, yeah, so they ended up using that as the term for the bounty hunters. So they just call them bounty hunters in the book then? Mm-hmm. Or like android hunters or... Bounty
hunters, mostly.
I think the term replicant was something that came up because in the 10 years between, the use of the term android had changed in sci-fi.
Okay.
And they wanted to make it very clear that this was like a, you know, organic matter. You know, it wasn't just a machine or a robot. Like they actually had like skin and flesh, you know, like they were people, copies of people basically. Like not quite clones, but, you know. Somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why they ended up going with the term replicant.
That makes sense. And it is the same in the book where, like, they have to do, like, a bone marrow test to see if they're human or not.
Oh, interesting.
And they do... That's part of the issue with the technology, too, is that the androids can only live for, like, a few years.
Yeah.
So...
And is that considered, like, just a byproduct of the way that they're made, or is that on purpose.
It's a byproduct of the way they're made. And they're trying to, I think, in fact, make them live longer.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that's something that's like present in the movie, but they actually explicitly say that they're given a shorter lifespan so as to like reduce the chance of them getting to, you know, human basically and trying to revolt, because that's, you know, a big part of the problem. That's why they're all being hunted down to begin with. But yeah, so they purposely have a 4-year lifespan.
Yeah.
And that's a huge part of the plot of the movie.
Yeah.
Is the specific replicants that he's hunting down, trying to, you know, they know they're coming to the end of their life, and that's why they're running, and like this whole thing is happening, is that they want, you know, they're trying to go to the creator's named Tyrell in the movie. And so they're basically trying to get to him to say, extend our life.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that they just want a better life. They're tired of being people's like servants, and there is question as to whether or not they experience empathy, and a lot of them apparently don't experience empathy and think that empathy is not even real, which is interesting. There's this character, John Isidore, JR. Is he in the book, a movie?
No, not under that name anyway.
So he's a special, which is someone who's been negatively affected by the radioactive, you know, waste in the air, because this is a dystopian, like, post-nuclear Earth, right? So the radioactivity that's still present can affect people, which makes sense, you know? And so he is a little bit slow. You know, he's a little bit slow. I would actually say it's a pretty good portrayal of someone who's, like, you know, mentally different from, like, a neurotypical person. But, he actually lives in what they refer to as the peninsula south of San Francisco. Oh. The only peninsula directly south of San Francisco is Monterey, which is where we currently are and where I grew up.
Very cool. Which
is fun, also coming from The Shining, which was in Colorado, which we lived in Colorado for a while. But he houses some of the androids or replicants, depending on which version. And he actually manages to catch a spider. Are animals very present in the book?
It's in the movie, yeah. It's a huge part of things in there. It's not talked about. It's talked about directly a few times, but it's just part of the larger world where, like, animals are clearly very rare. Anytime there's a pet or something, they always ask, "Is it real or not?"
Yeah,
you know.
Okay, so this might be a good transition into that, because he finds a spider in his apartment complex after he's agreed to house these 3 androids. And he brings the spider into the house, and he's, like, amazed that the spider is alive, and he has never seen a spider, but he's always been prepared to catch one, and he's, like, so excited for this little tiny being. And they start cutting its legs off. Oh. Yeah. And they're just like, why does it need so many legs? And so they start literally just cutting the spider's legs off, and eventually, when it has, like, 3 legs left or something like that, he just takes it and, like, flushes it down the sink.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And that was a huge moment for me, where it's like, that's when they're saying they don't think empathy is real. And they are doing that, which makes you think, okay, they probably don't have empathy. But then at the same time, they're making other decisions that do make you think they have empathy.
Right. There's a lot of that back and forth, I think, present in both versions, probably, then.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing to me, too, and that's part of my issue, I think, with the portrayal of some of the characters in the movie, is that they talk about all these things that are very interesting and make sense, like that replicants are made without empathy, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, like, the number one distinguishing feature. Yeah. But again, a lot of them are presented as being empathetic, and a couple of them do a really, really good job about that. Like, the main guy that is being hunted, his name is Batty, and he definitely, like, he has this great, you know, the speech at the end right before he dies, and you can feel a lot of that empathy in what he's saying, and it's a really, really good speech. It's probably one of the best parts of the movie. But then at the same time, you have all these other guys where it's like the entire time, you know, they talk about these replicants that they're hunting, and they're being like older models. And then you have Rachel, which is like the newer model,
Yeah.
right? She's been constructed to be harder to detect as a replicant versus a human. And, you know, they talk about this Voight-Kampff test taking so much longer with her, like over 100 questions they have to ask when it's usually like 30 before he's able to determine that she's a replicant. She's the most robotic person in the whole movie.
That's interesting.
It's, you know, like, you basically, and a lot of the main replicants, like Leon and Batty are a couple of the main ones, they come across as more human. I mean, it's a quote itself in the movie, right? That's the replicants are more human than human. So I think it's purposeful in a way, but it's also so confusing because of the way that they describe things. Because they keep saying, like, okay, they, like, the opening scene is this guy, Leon, this replicant, getting a Voight-Kampff test.
Yeah.
And he seems so, like, passionate and engaged and emotional.
Yeah.
And it says this is a test to spark emotion, right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, he's clearly a replicant.
Yeah.
And then later on, they do it with Rachel.
Yeah.
And she gives, like, the most robotic answers possible.
Yeah.
And they're like, damn, this one's really hard.
That's
like,
really interesting.
it's so confusing to me. And I don't know if it's just, like, the actors that did it, and they didn't have, you know, again, he didn't put a whole lot of care into directing them as characters and actors. So I wonder if maybe that part just got out of hand and wasn't presented the way it was meant to.
Yeah.
Or so. But it's, like, a complete inverse of what they're describing with words versus what you see.
So, I don't know if they really describe the Voight-Kampff test or how it works in the movie.
Sort of. I mean, well, you see a couple of them happen.
So basically, they're aware that the responses a lot of them give will be correct. So they're checking things like if their, like, heart rate goes up, or if their, like, more blood supply is going to certain things, or how their eyes react.
Right.
Right. So I can give them a pass for that, I guess. But I kind of wished there was more consistency in the book, too. Because when you see them start, like, cutting off the spider's legs and it's, like, struggling across the table, like, even if you don't love spiders, you're still kind of like, that's kind of cruel.
Yeah, right.
So when you're posing the question of, like, empathy and stuff like that, pose the question. But I guess that's actually a question that's almost answered, is that, like, these people, well, these androids are not capable of empathy, but Deckard is capable of empathy toward them. Right. Or JR is the special is capable of empathy toward them. Also, I want to be clear that special is the term they use for JR.
Yes, got it.
I promise that's not the term I decided to use.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I it's like part of me likes the ambiguity of it not giving answers, because I don't think that it needs to. I would rather it just pose questions that make you think about humanity than it directly trying to answer them, because a lot of them don't have an answer, or at least not one that's easy to get across. But I don't know. It's I feel very conflicted about that part of it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also why you need that little bit of consistency, is because it lets you think. Whereas when you suddenly see something that's so, like, wow, that's very robotic.
Yeah.
You know, it kind of gives you an answer.
I don't know. It's interesting. And it is, like, I just don't know. It's almost like, because of the dystopian setting of the world, all the humans are so, like, I don't know, like, they seem so devoid of emotion.
Yeah.
There's only a couple people in the whole movie that I would be like, yeah, that's, like, for sure a human being.
Yeah.
All the rest of them are just sort of, like, going along with every, you know, it all seems so robotic. And so, in a way, again, I don't know which parts of this are intentional or not. Yeah. But I guess it's interesting in that aspect, because it's just, like, it all kind of blends together, and does any of it matter, like, human or replicant? I don't know.
I guess it's also interesting, because the 3 androids that hide with JR are kind of mean to him, too. And he sort of hopes to find a camaraderie with him, because specials are excluded from society. They're not allowed to emigrate to Mars or anything like that, whereas I think they're called normals or something like that, can emigrate, but are often choosing to stay behind for some reason that I don't understand. That's another thing that probably could have benefited from more explanation, or from better note-taking on my part, in case I forgot. Lest we forget.
Well, question. So they specifically refer to people going to Mars?
Yes.
Okay, and that's all?
Yes.
Okay, because in the movie, it's only referred to as off-world.
Okay.
And I think that they sort of talk as if there's, like, multiple colonies all over the place.
Yeah.
They don't specifically name any planets or, like, say how many exactly. I think in the sequel, it talks about it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Where they at least, like, expand to, like, 9 more planets or something. Like, I don't know. But it's also presented as only the people who, like, have some sort of issue, sort of what you're talking about, like, that have some sort of physical disability or medical issue or are too poor or something like that. Those are the only people that haven't gone off-world at this point. And it doesn't really talk specifically, like you mentioned, like, the radioactivity and stuff like that. None of that's, like, explicitly said in the movie. Which, again, I like and dislike at the same time, because it's, like, you have to think through it, and it obviously presents it as a world that you wouldn't really want to live in. It's obviously very polluted and, like, just not a fun looking place. So it's no surprise that people would want to leave, but just none of the history of that or, like, why it's like that is talked about at all.
Yeah, so I think that also gets a little bit into a topic we often discuss, where movies are inherently a shorter format.
Yeah.
Right? Well, I should not say inherently, because short stories can be shorter than a movie, but a novella is longer than a movie, even a pretty long movie.
Well, except maybe 2049, because that's a long movie.
Okay. I promise you it took me longer to read this than it took for you to watch that. But it is one of those things where, you know what? Showing the world as dirty and clearly overrun with, you know, grossness, as opposed to saying nuclear holocaust, might be okay.
Yeah.
You can say the world has become uninhabitable or hard to inhabit through just visual cues, because you do have to start picking and choosing what do we put in. And I think it's fair, especially given that JR, who's the one person affected by the radioactivity in the air, is not even in the movie. So what does the radioactivity really have to do if you take out the effect of it? Nothing.
To me, it just seems like in the book, it was talked about more as, like, some sort of nuclear thing.
Yes.
And in the movie, I think it's more like climate change directed. So I think that they probably just tried to move away from that a little bit. But
I do believe they talk about, like, World War III and stuff like that in the book. 68, World War II had been over for, like, 20 years by then.
Yeah, 25.
So I'm not sure why he wanted to go that route, but maybe he didn't know climate change was the thing yet, and then other people did know climate change was the thing. Right. Or they saw the direction a little bit more of, you know, fast fashion happening, more consumerism, cars, pollution, you know, just that general train. And you don't even have to know global warming is a thing to be like, things seem dirtier, you know?
A lot of things changed in the time between when that was written and when the movie was made. Even, you know, just when the screenplay started getting written and stuff. Like, a lot of people learned a lot of things about the world during that time. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a time of a lot of learning.
Yeah.
I'm really curious. In the book, the two big powerhouses for, like, government powerhouses are the United States and the Soviet Union. Not Russia, the Soviet Union.
Right.
When this book was written, the Soviet Union was still a thing. I think it was a thing for quite a while after the book was written.
Yes.
Do they talk about that in the movie?
They don't talk about nationalities at all.
See, I think that makes more sense. Though I do think it makes sense to be like, we have governing bodies, you know, because you kind of need those, I guess. Yeah. So here's one big governing body, here's another big governing body. I just thought it was really cool. One of them was the Soviet Union, but then I think it's even cooler that they don't even talk about nationality, because that is the point where, you know, even nowadays that's becoming less of a thing. So I think that they clearly had the foresight to see that trajectory.
Well, yeah, it's like it stops mattering, because there's such a in the movie, at least, there's such a focus on, like, globalism. Everything is, like, globalized. It's homogenized in a way. You know, there's differences in how things are presented, but like I said, there's a huge influence of that, like, diverse culture all kind of blended together in one. And so there actually is, I believe it's found in the original. I know for sure that there's several references to things being in Russian in 2049, but they don't, again, specifically like mention any countries or anything like that.
Okay, yeah, that kind of, again, makes me think that, you know, PKD didn't really think about that globalization aspect or the moving forward with, like, you know, sexism dissolving or not dissolving, you know, as seems to be attempted to address in 2049. He was very much stuck in his white American view of the world, down to the point of even using the Soviet Union, which is just kind of like amazing to me to read that nowadays. But yeah, it's just, you know, there isn't that globalization present clearly because the Soviet Union and the US governments operate totally separately, and they have to like collaborate to do these things. And they talk about bringing a cop in from the Soviet Union to help one of the bounty hunters. Turns out he's not a cop, but an android, you know, gets retired. That's a whole thing. But yeah, there's that, I guess, lack of globalization, which again, having that diversity in creation would probably make you think of that a little bit more.
Well, it's really interesting, you know, I mean, because it's not like that was all over by the time the movie came out. The Soviet Union was still around, right? For 10 more years. Or almost. And, you know, I don't know, I guess it's like, if I place myself in his shoes that early on into the Cold War, you kind of can't think about any other reality, like, to the level of which, like, the fear and the divisiveness that was there between those two powerhouses, like, it's kind of hard to imagine a world that's not like that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting to me that he wouldn't have assumed that after some sort of, you know, nuclear fallout or something, that, like, one side or the other wouldn't have won out.
Yeah. That
they would still both be kind of these divisive powerhouses. But, pursuing it from that standpoint, I find to be very believable. You know, it's hard, but it's just so funny because you can be so imaginative in these other ways and then so constrained in these others, you know.
And I think also it is a good point in that, you know, there's this huge nuclear war. I don't know that they address who it's between, but evidently it doesn't change these boundaries, right? He's maybe making an anti-war point, in fact, by stating that, look, this nuclear war happened and there's still a divide. So it's possible it was intentional that he left two separate, you know, countries or governing bodies, I guess. Because I don't really know that they're, like, countries anymore. I don't really know the government systems, and he doesn't really delve into that. So I do wonder if that was a choice he made. I would guess it's not a choice he made based on some of the other things in the book that are extremely old-fashioned and outdated now, like physical currency. Deckard literally uses like a payphone with quarters or something like that, and they don't call them like dollars. I think they call them ducats. So at least he used a different term. But it's like, bro, we all know he's just paying with quarters to make a phone call to his wife. Nowadays, I'd tap my card on that, and 30 years from now, maybe I'll just swipe my palm across it or do a retinal scan and it'll drain my bank account for me. By the way, in case you were wondering, Soviet Union dissolved in 1991.
Yes. I know.
Okay, well, I looked it up while you were talking.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way, because like I said, this, you know, visually this movie creates such an interesting world, and it's so unique and it's so poignant in 2023 to watch it in some ways, like the gigantic, huge, you know, screens on the sides of buildings and stuff like that. You know, this is something that was very much invented for this film, and then it's very much present in our modern day. But then there's things like, okay, so yeah, instead of using a payphone, it's a video call. Yeah. But it's still like a payphone in a bar that Deckard uses at some point. And then it flashes up like, it's like $1.25 to, you know, for this call or something. So it's like, partially it makes sense, but then it's also, and then they have like, you know, all of these really old-fashioned looking TVs, and they're, you know, that are like very 80s, but they're doing like all these like very enhanced, like, you know, voice commands and all this kind of stuff with it, the, you know, enhancing pictures and all
Yeah.
these fancy technological things, but then it's on this like Magnavox TV or something, you know, that looks like it's from 1982. And so there's all these like markers where it's so futuristic in some ways, but then there's so many like markers of the time it was made. There's a bunch of like Atari like Atari is like taking over the world as like this technological company, which is really funny. And it's like in 2049 that's updated and it's Sony, you know, which is much more, obviously that's only 6 years ago, so that still makes sense for us, but it's like looking back, you know, to Atari, it's like, oh, well, not so much. But
they are video calls in the book.
They are,
as well. Yeah, but honestly, it just, that, it's like you're saying, it felt like you were like, oh, you tried.
Right. It's,
you know,
this
it's
really
not
interesting
like,
mix.
Exactly. I love the fact, though, that they still have their, like, 10-inch, 200-pound TV. But they can use voice commands with it.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's like me, you know, I still keep our old CRT around, so...
But that thing doesn't do voice commands. Though, maybe if we plugged, like, one of those, like, Google Cloud or the Android sticks in it.
I don't think that's compatible. I don't think it has a USB port.
Oh, good point.
We can use, like, a Super Nintendo mic, you know?
Yeah. See? The future. Super Nintendo walked.
Yeah.
So Google could run.
Right, exactly. We should just go back, I think.
The good old days.
Yeah, that was one of my like favorite aspects of it, though, is just that like super interesting, like it's so dated but so futuristic at the same time, and like the different ways that they thought. Another thing that was interesting too is that there's like people still driving on the street, but there's also hover cars.
Yeah.
And all of the cars like look like what the 80s thought a futuristic car. Like they all look like a DeLorean or something similar, you know, like.
And they all have doors that open upward.
Right, exactly. And then of course, I don't know if you know this, but that's like Elon Musk made the Cybertruck based off the designs of the cars in Blade Runner.
He did?
Yeah, so that's like very much that, like, yeah. It's one of those interesting things where it's like movies and properties like this are so like ingrained in the culture that it almost prophesizes itself, you know? It's like,
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah,
basically.
it's really interesting. But...
Yeah.
Okay, so two other things. We keep not quite getting to what the world is described as, and like I'm curious of like, because the visual is such a huge part of the movie, I'm just curious how the visuals of like the city are described. You know, how are there separate cities? Like I said, in the movie, it's very much presented as like the California coast is just one huge long city at this point. Are there like different areas, or like, you know, how does it work?
That's a really good question. So I don't think that's ever addressed in the book.
Okay.
The descriptions of the city, yeah, they're pretty few and far between. You know, they're using hover cars. You know, they're landing on top of buildings. I did not see any description for normal cars. They don't really even address how far the peninsula south of San Francisco is, or what the space in between is like, even when Deckard finally travels down there toward the end of the novel. You do get a good amount of description of JR's apartment complex, where he thinks he is literally like the only person there, and it's very run down. It's an abandoned building, effectively. Well, not even effectively, literally. It's an abandoned building, except for him. All the apartments still have stuff in them that people have left behind, and they call it kipple. It's just stuff that they say it multiplies. It's basically, you know, that mess you have on your desk, and how every time you turn around it's bigger? That's
Sure.
kipple.
Okay.
Like, that's the concept of kipple, too, is that you're just like, how is this mess growing? And really, it's your own fault. But JR thinks that it actually multiplies on its own, and that's kind of... I thought that was really endearing. I like that a lot.
Funny.
But there's not a lot of description, you know? So I think Ridley Scott kind of had this semi-blank slate to play with as far as visuals go.
Well, then that's really impressive that, like, Philip K. Dick ended up saying that is how he envisioned the world, if there's not that much description. Like, I don't know, that's pretty impressive, I guess.
Yeah. Sometimes authors will write something and they'll picture something and they won't be very good at describing it.
Right.
I would know.
You would know.
So it does seem likely that he wrote this whole world and he had this futuristic idea of lights and colors and everything. And he just didn't convey it very well. It's also possible I don't remember.
Sure.
Pretty sure I do remember that one, though. Because
I feel like it would have stuck with you if it was, like, really well described.
Exactly. And, like, I remember the apartment complex really well and stuff like that. But a lot of the other stuff, it's not, not very vivid.
I mean, that's part of the beauty of these adaptations, I guess, then. That's part of what we're talking about, is that each of these mediums have their strengths, and so it's very cool that it was able to be visualized in that way.
And no matter how vivid you try to be in a book, a movie will simply always be more vivid. You know what I mean?
It's there right in front of you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just how it goes.
Exactly. It's a visual medium. So I could describe an amazing world with neon lights and hover cars and people lining the streets and talking, or you could literally basically be in it.
Yeah.
By hearing it and seeing it. And maybe you're in a place with big enough speakers that you even feel that bass and reverb from the speakers. So it's going to be like that. And I think in this case, I wouldn't necessarily say that's a fault of the book. It's not a visual medium, so as fun as it is to describe those things, other things are going to be more important most of the time in books. And he probably made a good choice leaning on the other things more, but he didn't really fulfill a lot of those needs either, so maybe it was not a good choice. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and that's the other thing I really want to talk about, is what exactly the story is that's in the book, because like I said before, it's, just to kind of segue it, this is very much not the strength of the movie, in my opinion. It is such a visual thing, it's very atmospheric, and it's like part of me... This is what I'm really conflicted about, because it's like I so appreciate the passivity of which it creates this world. Like, it's so matter of fact about it. It's just like, this is the world in which people live, and everything does truly feel lived in this world. People feel like they belong there, and it because it's not like holding your hand and telling you all these individual pieces about the world. It's just letting it sort of wash over you as you watch it. I appreciate that aspect of it, because it does just make it feel so natural, and it creates something really special in that way. And so that's why, again, like that style portion of it is, like, I mean, almost perfect in my opinion. Outside of like those somewhat dated things that we talked about, it holds up so well. And he did a lot of like really just normal special effects, like practical effects that held up really, really well. So it creates all that. It's just that, like, because of the passivity of which it's sort of like introducing these questions but not answering them, it's creating this world but not telling you why it's like this. All of that would be fine if it was presenting a really well-structured story within it, and then it also had that passive element, but I just don't find the story itself to be good enough to match up to it.
Okay, so at the end of the day, movies and books are both forms of storytelling. Mm-hmm. Whether you like it or not, a movie is a form of storytelling. It can be used for other things. It's a form of storytelling.
Sure.
That's just what people want from it. The book actually has a good story. It is very story-driven, perhaps to the detriment of other things, because he follows that frickin' story. But okay. It starts with Deckard being informed that one of his higher-ups has been shot by a laser gun or laser tube or whatever they call it, hunting these new types of androids. And now it is Deckard's job to take them on. That's why he goes to the Rossen Association to learn more about these androids and make sure the Voight-Kampff test works on them. And then he goes back to finish hunting these androids, and that's why Rachel Rossen is trying to interfere. She doesn't want him to complete his story. And then he goes on down to Monterey, to where JR is. I'm sorry, the peninsula south of San Francisco. He goes down there to finish the hunt of the androids.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And then there are some other character things. Like at the very end, do they talk about mercerism in the book?
Mercerism.
Oh, okay. I don't fully understand what mercerism is either. It's kind of like... who's the guy who pushes the boulder up the hill and then it rolls down? Sisyphus?
I don't remember.
Anyway, Greek mythology.
Sure.
Guy pushes boulder up the hill, it rolls down. He's basically ripped that off with this guy, this old guy who walks up this hill, and that's all he does, and, like, people throw rocks at him, and you can, like, fuse with him in an empathy box and experience what he's going through and experience all the emotions of everyone else in their empathy boxes at the moment. So if you're really happy, you'll come out sadder because you've absorbed some of that from the other people. But if you're really sad, you can go in there and absorb joy from others, right? So the idea is like sharing happiness and having a place to go to lift you up. But at the end of the novel, which is super weird, but Mercerism is a huge point in the story, Deckard flies to the mountains north of San Francisco, I believe, and he like replicates that, where he like walks up the mountain and like a rock gets thrown at him, which is a big key point in the book that they keep bringing up. So the story, I would say, is like super tight. He is able to foreshadow things. He brings things back around, you know. So the story is probably the strongest part of the book, in fact.
That's, yeah, interesting.
What is the plot for the movie?
I mean, it's not dissimilar. Like, Deckard is a retired Blade Runner.
Which is a bounty hunter?
Yes.
Okay.
He gets pulled back in because there are this group of replicants that I guess someone else tried to hunt down. They've been murdering a lot of people. Like, they were like escaped slaves on a off-world colony or something. And then, so basically they go and find Deckard because he was like the best of the best. You know, it's one of those kind of, you know, one last ride kind of things. And, it's basically just him going to hunt down these, you know, they're in various places throughout the story and they come together and go far apart again. And, you know, but there's like a group of like 6 that he's hunting down. And, basically, you know, again, he goes to Tyrell Corporation, the creator of the replicants, and meets Rachel there. All that's the same. And then in the end, they leave together to go like start a life.
Really?
Yeah. And that's the difference, the main difference between the theatrical cut that was released in the US in 1982 versus what eventually became first the director's cut, I think in the late 90s, and then what's considered the final cut, like the actual vision of Ridley Scott, which was released in 2007. And the theatrical cut, it has what they just call the happy ending, where you actually see them leave. And then they're like driving off and this is where the connection comes into our last episode. They used unused stock footage of the hills of Colorado from The Shining in this final scene. But it's kind of them just driving away off into this, you know, it's like the first time you see the sun. Oh. You know, it's not like there's no city there. So it doesn't say exactly where it is, I don't think. But yeah, you just sort of see them leaving that way. In the final cut, it is much more ambiguous. They leave Deckard's apartment, they go down the elevator, boom, music hits, credits roll. Interesting.
So it's almost like the original theatrical version decided to end on a similar note with nature. Because Deckard is in a place that's like completely nature. And he sees a toad, which turns out to be fake. But he does go back home afterward. But he has like a new perspective on life, which is kind of nice. Deckard is an active bounty hunter. He's not retired. Okay. He is also hunting 6 androids. One is in the police station, one was the Soviet cop who he was supposed to work with, one is an opera singer, and then the last 3 are down including Batty, he's one of them, are down in Monterey. Okay. So, and he does successfully retire all 3. Yeah. And then Rachel leaves after, quote unquote, seducing him. She goes back to the Rawson Association.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he goes back to his wife. Huh. Who I feel like they have at the beginning.
He has a wife in the book. Yeah, so he does not have a wife in the movie.
Well, he kind of has a wife in the book. She's like barely present. She does, I think they try to communicate a few times, but she's like queen depression at the beginning. I adore her. Okay. She's like, they have these mood organs that help them pick what mood they want to be in that day. And she's like, I want to try being in like a deep, dark despair. So and then
just what you would be doing.
Yeah, totally. And then he calls her later in the book And she's just like, has no will to live. And he's like, are you using the mood organ again? And she's like, maybe. So,
no.
Yeah, she's like using the mood organ to feel supremely depressed.
Oh my God.
And then at the end, they come back together and he brings like the toad and she's really sweet at the end. I actually quite like her, but she's not really a greatly fleshed out character, as with most women in the book. But, she's cool. And yeah, that's what also makes the whole Rachel Rawson thing weird. He has a wife and then he has an affair.
Right.
But there's no like, he doesn't. So I was left thinking like, are affairs normal in this world? Is he having an affair and not thinking about it?
Does it not count because she's an android?
Does it not count? Yeah. So again, you're trying to pose these ethical, moral questions. This dude's having an affair with an android. That's like a peak moral, ethical question that we could potentially relate to.
But it's just kind of like glazed over or what?
They don't even talk about it. It's not even glazed over. He does not talk about it.
Well, I mean, it happens, so
it happens,
but you can ask your own questions.
Yeah, you can ask your questions, but it's not addressed in the book. It's like he has the affair, and it's like your wife is at home depressed. Yes, it's artificially depressed, but she's depressed.
Well, it does feel like it needs to be at least like talked about a little bit. If it's raising the question of how human are these androids or replicants, then does it count? Does it not? Like what's the feeling there? Yeah.
And if he's allowed to have empathy towards these androids and specifically be in love with one of these androids, where's his empathy for his wife? Or what does that make him feel with his wife? That's like a huge question about like romantic relationships are so frickin' human. It's like peak human. Yeah. There are not that many species that mate for life and live as long as us, So it's like, that's such a huge question they could have posed and they could have very intentionally put in front of you. And they don't even address it. He just has the affair and they don't talk about the wife for like chapters on either end.
Interesting. I guess I'm happy that the movie, he doesn't have a wife. Like, that sounds like an interesting aspect of the book. But yeah, I don't think it would have worked in the movie so well. I
think it could have been an interesting aspect to the book.
But it wasn't fleshed out.
But PKD fell flat on that. Yeah. I think a lot of his characters kind of fell flat like that.
Well, again, 5 marriages. I mean,
he did have, and he was on his 4th. And they all ended in divorce. Yeah. All 5 of his marriages ended in divorce. It's, I really need to read more about that. I think also he himself did have some mental health stuff going on, and he was a really interesting guy, and it sounds like one of his relationships was perhaps a little bit violent, with both of them being maybe not the best fit for each other, to put it very lightly.
Sure.
But yeah, I think the wife probably just should have been kind of cut, but it's also like, so Deckard is like in love with this android supposedly, but then he's trying to buy a real animal for his wife so they can finally have that status symbol. Which, by the way, he does buy a goat and then Rachel Rawson throws it off the top of the building. What? Which was like, I freaking love Rachel right now.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, don't throw goats off of the top of buildings. That's terrible.
That's funny as hell.
But like, she leaves after he's bought this goat, right? He buys the goat. I guess he introduces the goat to his wife, but he goes to go sleep with Rachel Rawson. And then Rachel Rawson throws the goat off the top of the building when he decides to go kill the other androids.
Damn.
Yeah, it was intense.
I guess she proved a point.
Which actually I think is a more interesting, ethical, and empathetical, and moral question than having the spider's legs cut off.
Right.
Rachel was trying to protect other androids. She had a relationship with Deckard, and she's upset, right? Or so we think. So she throws a goat off of the top of a building. It's his animal.
Yeah.
Would she have cared for that animal had that not happened? Would she have wanted to do it? Did she feel bad about it? We wouldn't know because we don't even see her throw the goat off the top of the building. We learn about it through his wife, whose name is Iran, by the way, like the country. I don't know if it's pronounced the same way, but we're going to just stick with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like if they had cut out all that like weird spider leg cutting off scene and just had that be like your android interaction with a real animal, it would be fascinating because you would ask so many questions. But, anyway, she throws a goat off the top of the building.
Rad. Well, yeah, so talking about the nature of love in this is something that maybe it could have been expanded on a little more in both senses. Like I said, like, I didn't find there to be any reason for, like, him to fall in love with Rachel. It's kind of just a strange relationship. Like I said, I think a lot of that has to do with, like, them talking about how she's so human-like, but then her just not coming across that way at all in the movie and her portrayal. But yeah, it's like there's no moments where they like fall in love. It's just kind of like, oh, I see you and now I'm in love with you. Like, there's no development of the relationship or anything. And then, like I said, I like it because I like the ending, especially the final cut ending. But yeah, there's just not a lot of substance to that at all. Yeah. And it's really confusing because it's like you said, it is such a huge part of being human. Yeah. So it should be a huge part of this question that this property is asking. So I don't know.
If it's going to include romance, it should ask questions, or it should not include the romance, basically. Right. Because that's the whole point, of this story, is to ask those questions. But you can't include something like that, And
then it gets interesting. It really plays around a lot with that in the sequel in 2049. It turns out that Rachel didn't have a limited lifespan.
Okay.
And so her and Deckard actually live, it kind of, in a way, it weakens the first movie because I did like the ambiguity of the ending.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And you don't know if they're going to get away and stuff. But then in 2049, it takes away all of that mystery, which, like, for good, some good and some bad. Yeah. Like, it also pretty much cements the fact that Deckard is not a replicant in the sequel.
Yeah.
But the whole plot of the sequel is kind of that Rachel ends up being able to bear a child.
Okay.
She was designed to be able to be impregnated.
Okay.
And so, but they are trying to keep it a secret.
Interesting. Rachel has a limited lifespan as far as in the book. Like, after they have sex, they talk about, like, how she's 2 years old and how she only has 2 years left or something like that. But again, they're talking about it from this weird perspective of romance, and it's just why can't it just be physical attraction in this? Maybe the people who wrote these didn't understand the difference between physical attraction and romantic attraction.
Right. Well, it almost is I don't know. And that's part of what I really like about 2049 is that it purposefully conflates them.
Yeah.
And I think that that's more the point, right?
Yeah.
Is that people have trouble separating those things out a lot.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, and it plays around with love a lot more interestingly in that. Like Ryan Gosling's character in that movie, he is in a relationship with, they've now developed these personal computer companion partners that are holograms. They're not replicants, and there's a whole thing where, this girl this computer girl that he's in this relationship with hires a replicant girl to come to have sex with him so that they're
I've seen that iconic scene.
with Ana de Armas's face
Anyway,
so it's to me all of that is way more interesting. It still doesn't deep dive into it, but there's more of that present in the sequel, which is something that I appreciated. I felt like it did a better job of exploring those topics a little more directly. But that's just an example of something that I think was done a little bit better that was totally missing from the original.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I'm also curious how you said that there is very much that pulp noir kind of feel to the book. So I'm curious how that comes across.
I would say that it was PKD's intent to have that pulp noir thing,
but it doesn't
come
necessarily
across. I get it. It is kind of got that he's a grumbling old bounty hunter, what is more pulpy noir than some cop or a cop adjacent guy being grumpy about something and then having some sort of femme fatale who's this hot young woman. It's so short that I don't know that he was given the space to explore it. And JR has about half of the chapters. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. He's a major character.
Oh, wow.
But he he doesn't feel necessarily pulp noir, but maybe also in that period that like grungy, dark, depressing was kind of like noir.
I mean, yeah.
Noir was like the dark side of humanity. And now we just call that dystopian cyberpunk, right?
Right.
So I guess back then maybe that's more like they didn't have those terms or classifications yet.
Right, they probably
which goes
I don't
back
remember
to,
when they started using that term, but it
Yeah.
was much later on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it goes back to him creating basically a genre of cyberpunk,
Yeah.
which has those elements inherently in it because it's about like the dark side of humanity.
Right.
So I'm guessing that's part of why he was like injecting this pulp noir into it.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, like a movie, you know, like we talk about, it plays to different strengths. It has an advantage in that sense because, you know, it can show these like kind of long distance shots of him walking down a dark street with kind of the smoke flying by, and, you know, have this kind of like smooth, jazzy, synthy kind of soundtrack and stuff, you know, and it's like there is no question at all that this has that noir vibe. So it's kind of interesting in that way, yeah.
And I have not read a lot of pulp.
No, I haven't either. I've only seen the visual medium.
Exactly. So I don't know that I can give a fair assessment of that either.
That's true.
But that's my guess, you know, as to why he made that comparison.
Well, it makes sense because it's become such an integral part of what cyberpunk is. So it's curious to me like where that sort of originated from and how he comes across. But just the hard-boiled and the femme fatale aspects seem like enough that, you know, at least the movie was able to take those aspects and run with it. But it definitely made a point of that being like the way it's presented. And another interesting thing, which is it's one of the most like derided portions of the theatrical cut, is that it has these kind of like Raymond Chandler-esque monologues that Deckard is doing. You know, like narration monologues.
Okay.
That's very noir-like.
Yeah.
But they're so terribly done.
Really?
Because they weren't supposed to be included. Like there's a whole production side of things too, where the writers had written them, and then I actually have seen an interview with one of the writers, I forget which one, who saw the cut that finally came out with them and was like, that is none of the words that I wrote. This is terrible.
Oh, wow.
So I guess the studio like completely rewrote the monologues and then had Harrison Ford come in to record them, and you can feel how fucking angry he is about having to record. Like he just sounds mad and bored and like just is so not into it. And so they just come across so terribly. So thank God those were removed in the later ones. But it's like, part of me likes it because it does have that, you know, it's like like I said, like a Raymond Chandler, like Big Sleep kind of like, you know, Philip Marlowe or something, like kind of feel to it that's so noir. And it could have worked if they were done better, but it was bad. It was so bad.
And Harrison Ford's not really the kind of person to hide how he's
No.
feeling.
He will very much let you know how he feels.
Yes, he's always been a very honest actor.
Yes, definitely.
So as we're wrapping up here, Alan, do you have a favorite scene?
A favorite scene? Oh, that's tough. I mean, the scene with Batty right before he dies is, I mean, it's considered one of the best like monologues in film, and I am hard pressed to disagree with that. Interesting. It's really good. You should listen to it at least, I think. Okay. Maybe we'll even play it. It's really, really good. He's kind of just talking about like the things that he's seen, and it gives him a lot of humanity, you know, as it's this replicant kind of finally facing his end. Like this is towards the end where he's, you know, tried to increase his life and realized it's not going to happen, and he's been hunted, and like, it's a very, very good scene. And then I also really like the opening Voight Kampf test with the replicant called Leon. Because like I said, he comes across as very human in that, and they ask some really interesting questions, and it's kind of this very like quick back and forth between him and the interviewer, and I don't know, I just think it's really, really well done.
Wow, okay, that's cool. This really stuck out to me the moment I saw it, and I would say hands down it's my favorite part of the book, which interestingly, I just said that there's not a lot of description, and this is description that got me, which might also be what makes it more powerful. But I kind of just wanted to read it to you and see if you could like really pick up what it's about. Just a little bit of context. They're chasing down one Deckard and Phil Resch, his name is, the other bounty hunter. They've gone into a museum to follow, an art museum, to follow one of the androids. And the description from Deckard's perspective says something about, at an oil painting, Phil Resch halted, gazing intently. The painting showed a hairless, oppressed creature with a head like an inverted pear, its hands clasped in horror to its ears, its mouth open in a vast, soundless scream. Twisted ripples of the creature's torment, echoes of its cry, flooded out into the air surrounding it. The man or woman, whichever it was, had become contained by its own howl. It had covered its ears against its own sound. The creature stood on a bridge and no one else was present. The creature screamed in isolation.
Scream.
That's the scream, yeah. And that was, they don't tell you that until afterward they talk about like, oh, he did a wood cutting of it. And then if you look up the scream and you find this information, it's fascinating. But when you read that, that is such an amazing description of the scream. And it is
really good.
Yeah, hands down my favorite part in that whole book. It's in chapter 12. The PDF I'm in, it's on page 52, I think. So, really, really good.
That's awesome, yeah, because you can immediately visualize what that's talking about, and it's a well enough known painting that, you know, most people are going to get it when they read it, I think. But...
Yeah, and I love that, like, inverted pear.
Yeah.
Like, that's the moment that it clicked for me. I was like, oh my gosh, I can see it, you know?
That's really something. Well, okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I'll say again that, like, I feel conflicted, and I think this conversation did help cement how I feel about it a little bit, but I'm definitely still sticking to the style over substance aspect. Like I said, there are bright points in how the characters are presented. I just think there's a lot of weakness and things just kind of happen. And again, going back to my slightly spicy take, I do think that the sequel does a little bit better job of not just building this world. Like, obviously it had the advantage of this world had already been visualized, which is something the first one did a lot of heavy lifting with. But, like, 2049, I think, did an awesome job of keeping that visual and keeping that atmosphere, but also have, like, a more engaging story, which, like, you know me, I'm not someone who needs, like, a super cemented plot, like, point A to point B to point C. Like, I don't need that as long as whatever it's bringing up is interesting. But this is a movie that I think needs that. And it didn't have, like, you know, you have a detective that's not doing a lot of detective work in the original movie. I think that there's a lot more of that with Ryan Gosling's character in 2049. So I think that it's a really, really cool world. And I think that this book has clearly spawned some super awesome adaptations that have their own strengths in different ways. But that's kind of where I land on it. And I mean, frankly, without that book, or even without the first movie, we wouldn't have what I consider to be even better adaptations of this kind of world, like Ghost in the Shell, or like Akira, like some of these like late 80s, early 90s, you know, Japanese anime and stuff. Like, none of that kind of cyberpunk stuff would exist without this. And so I feel very, very happy that it happened the way that it did, because it made all those things happen, but I don't necessarily feel like the original 1982 Blade Runner is the best adaptation or version of that world.
Yeah, so for me, the book, I guess, is like the opposite. It's, you know, sort of substance over style. It's kind of lacking in a lot of this like flair and stuff like that, but it's got a story that it follows from beginning to end, and maybe not all the characters are solid. Some of the side stuff is not solid, but that core story, the core substance, is nailed. He got it down. He, you know, had a tight story. And I enjoyed it, you know, overall. For all of its weaknesses, it was a really fun read, and I was excited to see what was going to happen next. I was really curious, and I actually think this would be a negative to the book, but I was curious to read a chapter from an android's perspective. So it did get me thinking, like, what is this third perspective we're not seeing? So I do think it was a really good book. Super solid, super fun to read, not long. So for its faults, it's easy to get through. And it was just pleasant and got me thinking.
So do we have an answer to our ultimate question?
Is the book better than the movie? I think they complement each other.
I think so too.
I think that where the book had story, our substance, the movie had the style.
Yeah.
So maybe if we could combine those things and introduce some more diversity in the writer's room, we could have had something darn near perfect.
Well, I'm really curious to see how this possible TV show is going to go. I think it's going to be like a limited miniseries, like 10 episode or something, at least to start.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be set in 2099.
Interesting.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
And I'm very curious about what you're going to think about 2049 in 2050.
Right.
When we've passed that, and now you're saying, like, and they thought Sony was going to take over the world.
Yeah, which
but
corporation
now
will it
it's
be now?
Glinkle
Our alien overlord.
and the delicious crackers they make. Glinkle knobs.
Oh, tasty.
Well, I think that about sums up our thoughts.
Yep.
But before we sign off, Alan...
Oh boy, here we go.
It's time for our tagline quiz.
All right, what do you got for me?
I feel like I need some kind of musical jingle, but we'll work on that.
Yeah, we'll add that in post.
All right, so today, your tagline is...
Oh god.
12 is the new 11.
12 is the new 11.
Yep.
Ocean's 12.
Yep, it is Ocean's 12. 2004 crime thriller starring George Clooney, Brad Pitt, or Brad Putt, as my notes say, and Julia Roberts.
Julia Roberts as Julia Roberts.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know. I haven't seen the movie.
That's like one of the weirdest things about that movie is she's playing a character who then, in order to gain access to some way, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but in order to gain access to someone, she's Julia Roberts playing a different character who then pretends to be Julia Roberts.
That's really funny.
It's pretty funny.
I guess I need to start my Trek to the Ocean series.
Yeah, at least the first one.
Yeah. I told you last time I was going to give you one you could get, though.
Thanks for the softball. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. All the rest of them are gonna be a real slog, though.
Well, after the last episode, I needed one that made me feel better.
I'll pick out some more. Actually, there are a few others I think you'll get. Well, congrats, Alan. You have X amount of points in our tagline quiz.
Thank you.
I'm not keeping track. I don't think anyone is.
I don't know how the points work, but that's fine.
Well, that's all for now. Thank you for listening to In Contrast. I'm Nisha.
And I'm Alan.
Let us know what you think and your opinions. You can find us at In Contrast Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Next episode, we're talking about The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft and its intriguing 2005 adaptation by the same name, where we'll ask the important question, is the book really better than the movie?
See you next time.